and welcome to the Caterpillar Cross Stitch YouTube channel. My name's Ford from Son of a Stitch, and this week I'm going to be answering that age-old question, what the heck is Evenweave? Now, Evenweave is a term that is frequently used and also frequently misunderstood within cross-stitching communities. So I'm going to explain what Evenweave means and then what it is often used to mean, because they are just a little bit different. Basically, an even weave is any fabric that has the same number of strands in the warp and the weft. Those are the two directions of weave in a fabric. You've got your warp, which runs vertically on the loom when it's woven, and you've got your weft, which runs horizontally on the loom when it's woven. And any fabric that has the same number of threads in those two directions, or roughly the same number of threads in those two directions, is considered an even weave fabric. So there are a lot of fabrics out there that are even weave that aren't meant for cross-stitching, though usually you could actually cross-stitch on them. But when we say even weave within cross-stitching communities, we're usually contrasting that with Aida. However, Aida is actually an even weave fabric. If we take a look at this piece here, it's got the same number of threads horizontally as it does vertically. That makes it an even weave. Now, Aida is kind of a specialized kind of even weave in that within each of those threads, there are these little ribbons of 4 strands. And inside those ribbons, there's sort of a mini weave going on. 2 go up and 2 go down every time that they cross. So you're really only going through the fabric. You're really only using a hole every 4 strands, really. This is a piece of 11 count Aida that I'm using to illustrate because it's a little bit easier to see. So within the category of even weave fabric, that does actually include Aida. Aida is just a very special kind of even weave that's meant for cross-stitching. There are a lot of others that we use that usually are what people mean when they say even weave fabric. They're talking about even weave fabric apart from Aida. So if we take a look here, I'll show you some of the kinds that are frequently used. Possibly the most common single type of even weave fabric that we use for cross-stitching is known as linen. Linen is called linen because of the kinds of fibers that are used in it. So linen is not necessarily a type of fabric, it is a kind of fiber. But this is a linen even weave fabric. These all have their pros and their cons, which I'll talk about a little bit after I've introduced you to each of them. Then you'll also frequently see a type of fabric called Lugana. Lugana is made from a combination of synthetic and natural fibers, which makes it a little bit hard to dye, but it makes it really resilient and it makes it a little bit less prone to things like wrinkles and creases, so it's a little bit easier to work with in a lot of ways. There's also a kind of fabric known as Monaco. I'll turn the light on behind this so you can see it a little bit better. Monaco is made from cotton, so it's easier to dye, easier to take color, but it's a little bit harder to get wrinkles out of and to iron. And then there is a kind of even weave called Hardanger. Hardanger is a little bit like Aida, except that instead of 4 strands per one of these little weave ribbons, there are only 2 strands. Hardanger is used for a lot of other things, but it can also be used to cross-stitch. And one of the nice things about Hardanger is it has some special things you can do with it, especially in terms of doing some stitching and then cutting out sections of it. So for making decorative things like tablecloths and that kind of stuff with some filigree cutouts, Hardanger allows you to do that. But the ones that we're going to be concentrating and focusing on today are the higher count even weaves, 28 and above, like linen and Monaco and Lugana. Now, there are a lot of advantages to these higher count fabrics, most of which honestly are just really aesthetic. One of the things about Aida is that it's really easy to use because it's really easy to see where the holes are. The holes are pretty big, they're evenly spaced, and you don't have to count them. When stitching on Aida, each cross stitch is usually 1 hole. You come up 1 hole, you go over to the 1 diagonal from it, and then you come back down, and that's 1/2 of your X. With something of a higher count, usually you're stitching over 2. So instead of coming up from 1 hole and going back down through diagonally adjacent hole, you'll skip over 1, so that your stitch is going over 2 strands in the weave of the fabric. It's usually referred to as stitching over 2. So that's a term that you'll frequently see when somebody says, I stitched this on 28 count Monaco 2 over 2. What they mean is they used 2 strands of floss and they went over 2 lines of fiber in the fabric. Now, most of the time, that's how these higher count fabrics are used, which kind of obscures the gridded nature of the fabric. It makes it look a little bit more impressive and makes it a little less obvious that you just counted, right? That's the thing that surprises people the most about cross-stitching, is how really easy it is, because you're just counting. But the higher count fabrics, the even weaves and the linens, kind of hide that counted paint by numbers nature of it and make it look a little bit cooler, a little bit more impressive. They also are usually a little bit more flexible, a little bit less stiff than Aida. So they're a little better to use for making things that are decorative, like pillows and table runners and even clothing and that kind of stuff than Aida is, because Aida's kind of stiff because of that subweaving. Like there's a lot more friction inside the fabric, and that makes the fabric stiffer. Another nice thing about the even weaves is that you don't have to stitch over 2. You can stitch over 1. Very, very small stitches. So you can make a project much, much smaller. Tiny little intricate projects, which can be really fun to do. And one thing that's definitely a lot easier to do when you're stitching on even weave fabric over 2 is fractional stitches, 1/4 and 3/4 stitches. Because with Aida, in order to do a fractional stitch, like if you want to do a 1/4 stitch, you're going to come up through one hole in the fabric, and then you're going to pierce your needle down through the middle of that square within the fabric. But with even weave, because you're skipping over one hole, instead of having to pierce through the fabric, you can come up through the one hole, and normally you'd go skip over one and go to the next one. You can just go straight down through that one. So it makes fractional stitches a lot easier to do when you're working on even weave. So that can be a big advantage of it. Now I want to take just a second right now to remind you to join the Caterpillar Cross Stitch VIP Stitch Club. When you join, you'll get a free ebook with 8 PDF cross stitch patterns in it. Plus, you'll also get a year-long temperature tracker stitch-along cross-stitch pattern. You'll also get all the latest news about any upcoming goings-on at Caterpillar Cross Stitch, so about upcoming kits or patterns, or most importantly, things like socials and retreats. That information comes out in that newsletter, so make sure you sign up down there at the link in the description so that you don't miss out on any of those really exciting upcoming projects. Now, there are also some disadvantages to working with even weave fabric. One of those is that, so as I showed you with Aida and Hardanger, you have those sub-weaves. Like within the weave of the fabric, you have those little mini weaves between the holes that you use. And you don't have those with most of the even weaves that we've talked about. So they're a little bit more prone to unraveling because you don't have that internal friction within the strands of the fabric. So it's more important when working with an even weave fabric to make sure that you finish your edges in a nice, secure way, because they'll be more prone to unraveling because there's nothing to stop those fibers from just pulling out. So you have to be a little bit more fastidious about that with an even weave fabric because they will be more prone to unraveling. Now, as I said, linen is probably the most commonly used kind of even weave fabric that's not Aida, and it itself has some particular irregularities that can make it a little bit harder to work with, but also a little bit more rewarding. So linen, as I mentioned, is made from a particular kind of fiber. It's called linen. That's the plant that it's made from. And linen fiber is not quite as small and as workable as cotton fiber is or as wool fiber is. So it gets a little bit more uneven in the finish. Like if we look here on this piece that I've been showing you, you see this thick spot right here where the weave gets really, really thick? There's some just kind of clumps of fiber within those strands of the fiber of the linen. Those are referred to as slubs, and they're definitely something that occurs. So they'll make your stitches a little bit wonky, a little bit uneven. Now that is a feature of linen, not a bug. It's there intentionally in order to make your stitch look a little bit more old-fashioned, a little bit more rustic. So depending on the kind of project you're working for, you make that work for you. But you do have to give up a little bit of control with linen because it is a natural fiber, because it is a little bit less processed. You're giving up a little bit of control. You can't be quite such a perfectionist when you're working on linen because the fabric has a little bit of a mind of its own, and it is going to make things just a little bit irregular at times. So you just have to kind of accept that and remember to stand back and look at the bigger picture, and the bigger picture will be a little bit more old-fashioned, rustic, and beautiful piece for the right kind of project, but it is something to keep in mind. Now, if you've been a subscriber of the channel for a while, you've probably heard me talking about the importance of being a member of online communities. Online communities are a very powerful and tremendous resource for somebody who wants to get better at any hobby, and cross stitch is no exception. The Caterpillar Cross Stitch Facebook group has like 20,000 members. That's hundreds of thousands of years of experience. And then there are all the followers over on the Caterpillar Cross Stitch Instagram. So it's a really amazing community resource that's available to you. So I highly recommend taking advantage of both those. Another thing that can be a little bit more difficult when working with an even weave fabric is that because you don't have that sub weave, those little weaves within the weave, there's not much fabric, or there's not much friction or tension holding any two individual strands of the fabric together. So they can kind of slide against each other a lot more easily than the strands within Ada can. So that means that you have to be a little bit more careful when pulling your stitches, because you can kind of dislodge those threads a little bit. That does also mean that if you're stitching over one, you need to use a particular kind of stitch called a tent stitch. Now go back and watch my video about tent stitching, because tent stitches keep those strands from pulling through. There are particular instances where when you're stitching over one on a linen or an even weave, it's possible for your stitching thread to just slide between those strands of fabric, and then you have a missed stitch, and sometimes it will do it much later. So you have to be careful about that. But the tent stitch, which again, I made an instructional video on those, will stop that from happening. And because of the slight unevenness, and even in the case of the more even ones like the Monaco or the Lugana, just the size of it, how small it is, it can be a little bit harder to count. You know, sometimes you need to count, you're like, I need to go 5 stitches this direction. On Ada, that's easy, you count to 5. On linen or on Monaco or another even weave, you have to count to 2 5 times. So it becomes possible to miscount by 1/2 of a stitch. And that's a lot harder to spot visually as just an irregularity when you're checking over your work. So you have to be a little bit more careful about your counting when working on even weave, particularly when working over 2. And because it is a little bit softer, because it is a little bit more malleable, your even weave fabrics are also going to be a little bit more prone to bunching up if you pull your stitches too tight, because it can compress. It can slide in on itself. So you have to be a little bit less aggressive in pulling your stitches tight, but you have to keep them consistent too, because the fabric will respond to that tension more than an Ada will. It's a more beautiful project, but it is a little bit harder. So it's a step up in difficulty and expertise. Now, the final thing that can be a significant disadvantage to even weaves, and in particular linen, is that, again, those fibers are kind of flexible. And so the fabric can, if you look here what I'm doing, the fabric's weave can actually skew against itself. So while the weave is even and each of those little fiber squares should be square, it's actually really easy to make like wavy lines accidentally in it, especially when you're finishing it and framing it. So it makes it more important to iron it and to block it out like you would with knitting when you're going to finish it up, because you want to make sure that that weave stays square, because it does very easily skew and warp. So that's a big disadvantage of something you just need to be careful about, especially when finishing a project on even weave, and in particular linen. Now, there are a lot of pros and there are a lot of cons to using the higher count and even weave fabrics. The project does usually wind up more impressive and a little bit more beautiful, but it is a little bit more work, and it does require a little bit more fastidiousness on the part of the stitcher. So what about you? Do you have some particular tips or tricks that you use to make a beautiful project on linen or on Monaco or something like that? Leave your tips down in the comments for the other viewers. If you're enjoying my videos and you're learning something from them, please do me a big favor, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below telling me how good I'm doing. That really, really helps me. It also really helps the Caterpillar Cross Stitch channel, so I'd appreciate if you did it. Other than that, I do want to thank you so much for watching. For Caterpillar Cross Stitch, my name is Ford, and I will see you next time.